Welcome to Unmasking Social, where we talk about building real friendships and meaningful connections without masking who we truly are. I'm your host, Sharon Baum, a speech and language pathologist with an expertise in social thinking and how it relates to autism and ADHD, specifically with our teens and tweens. Let's dive in. The power of animals and how they can support our neurodivergent teens and tweens and young adults. Today on this episode, we focus on how animals can teach us about friendship, resilience, and all the things that keep us social. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Unmasking Social. Today, we have a wonderful guest who actually specializes in animals and how they interact with people, actually, and specifically individuals that are neurodivergent and have more specific needs. Dr. Aubrey Fine. Thank you so much, Dr. Aubrey, for being here.
Thanks, Sharon, for having me. I am looking forward to it.
Amazing. So, Dr. Fine, I know that you are a man of many different skills and you've had many lives already. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how it came to be that you're now this kind of animal expert?
Interesting. I like the word lives. I feel like I'm a cat now. And
They have many lives. Yeah.
So I'm a native of Canada. I'm a professor emeritus at Cal Poly State University, which is in Pomona, California. And I taught there for 42 years and recently retired from there. And now for the last 5 years, I'm an adjunct faculty at Utah State University in the Department of Animal and Dairy and Veterinary Science, where I've helped them develop a curriculum on human-animal bond and animal-assisted interventions. So I've written lots of materials, and really I don't need to share all of those things. But what I think is fun for me to share with your listeners, and then we can get right into whatever you want to talk about.
Sure.
Is they're talking to a person that never had a pet and never had an animal in his life until I was a young adult. So when I grew up in Canada, in Montreal, I was afraid of dogs. My mother didn't like animals. And in fact, when we would walk, she would always say, "Oh, stay away from that animal." So that was my beginning. And it was interesting that when I was a young college student, one of the areas that I'm interested in, and it could be a segue in our own conversation, I've always been interested in social skill training and development. And at that time in Montreal, while I was an undergraduate, I worked for the Quebec Association for Children with Learning Disabilities. And I had developed a very large-scale social skill program for kids at that time that were called learning disabled. Again, this is in the early 70s. And so the diagnostic criteria was very different than so many of the children in that program today could have been diagnosed with higher functioning autism, ADHD, Tourette's syndrome, lots of other conditions, including learning disability. So there are lots of neurodivergency in the program. And I'm going to tell you a story that will lead into this. And
Sure.
So I told you I never had a pet. And then when I was in college, I was working in this program. And all of a sudden, I wanted my first pet. And I was living at home. And although my mother didn't like animals, I had shared with her that we were going to get a mouse that we were going to put in the house, a little Dr. Zeus there for your listeners. But the long story short was when I brought the mouse home, my mother was super, super anxious. And she started to shout, "Don't drop the rat, don't drop the rat." It wasn't a rat, it was a little mouse.
Right.
And she made me so anxious that I said, "You know what, this isn't going to work." I went back to the store, said, "Don't want a refund. Here's the mouse. I am going to keep the cage and all the other accoutrements that went along with that." And I said, "I'll be back in about 3 weeks." When I went back in 3 weeks to at least, I thought, pick up the mouse, I found another little small creature, which was a gerbil. And
Ooh.
Sasha became her name, and she was my first animal companion. Now, you're probably wondering why this story relates to what we're talking about, but it will in about 45 seconds. I decided after a short while living with Sasha that I really, really loved having her. And I was going to bring her to the program that I directed to act as a show and tell. I was going to bring her and let these children meet her in the cold of Montreal. So not the cold of California, really a cold winter day in Montreal. And when I was greeted by so many children, some of them asked what kind of animal she was. They knew that she didn't look like a mouse because she was a darker a lighter brown, beige color. And lots of kids asked many, many questions. And some asked, can I hold her? And eventually I would have done that. But what I ended up doing is one boy, we'll just name him Stephen for the sake of the story, because this is going back to 1973. I looked at Stephen and said to Stephen, you know what? I'm going to let you hold her, but you got to promise me one thing. You got to promise me that you won't move. And I shared with Stephen that Sasha was my friend. And although I love the kids I work with, I also cared about my little pal. So Stephen and I sat down in the corner. I told him to cross his legs. And then I asked him, I'm going to put my hands up for a second. Yeah. I said, Stephen, I want you to make a little bridge. And I'm going to place Sasha in your palms. And so I did that. And again, I had shared with him again, you have to promise me that you won't move. And he agreed. And as Sasha got into his palms, she became super comfortable and then began to meander up his tummy. And Stephen's eyes were beaming with joy and pride. Now, 53 years later, I don't remember all the details, but what I do remember, and that will be the beginning of our conversation, was a little boy looking at me and saying to me, you see, I promised you I wouldn't move. And this was a boy that was really very hyperactive and very impulsive.
Right.
So Sasha changed my trajectory of life career. So when you use the word many, many lives, who would have thought that in those early years, I would become what the LA Times once wrote, the living Dr. Dolittle, except I don't talk to animals, although I do talk to my dogs and other animals, but I've learned to talk through them and learn to work alongside some very unique animals over that many, many, many years. So Sasha was one of my special small creatures that really changed my life. And we could talk about those creatures, whatever you'd like as time goes on.
Of course. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I really relate to you because I also grew up with a fear of dogs. And part of it was growing up, not to stereotype, because it's all about not black and white thinking with our autistic teens and tweens, but a lot of people will say, well, you grew up in Brooklyn, but because from the old school Brooklyn, New York, not like the trendy one where everyone has a dog now. So it was known that we were always like scared of dogs or didn't have a pet. And then I had an older brother and sister who didn't help because they would, every time a dog would come by, they would like run the other way. So I would start running the other way too. And it took me a very long time to overcome that fear. Part of it probably moving to Manhattan about 15 years ago and being surrounded by dogs and then realizing, wait, they have a special power. And that power was revealed to me in also a random way, which was when I was working in a specialized program for individuals with autism, now in the DSM with social communication challenges, the old school Asperger's. And off a grant, we had a comfort dog, which some schools do have. I don't know how many really have them across the country, honestly, but it was something that was a useful tool because sometimes when my students who are neurodivergent were experiencing different types of meltdown and I brought in the dog, it seemed to have almost taken the pressure off of social for them. And suddenly they were looking at the dog, they were petting the dog, and I found that they were able to also communicate a little bit more about what they were feeling so that I could understand like better what was triggering. Because in the middle of a meltdown, even for a dog or a cat or any pet, you don't want to startle them by asking them questions. So it kind of almost gave them like a voice in the moment. And I couldn't believe that I was sent on after this girl that was once so fearful of animals actually was sent to a training for this comfort dog system. And I remember just having to really sit in that training and confront the fear, and everything changed in terms of my perspective towards animals because of that moment. So I do relate to you in terms of the involvement of the connection with pets and animals. And you mentioned a lot of things about how you started noticing that pets are special, but they have a unique ability to connect with people who are really struggling with certain learning differences across the board. And you right now are in California, even though you're native Montrealian or
Montreal, Canada. Yeah.
No, what is it called? A Montrealian? I always get it wrong.
I think so. I've never really thought about it that way. But
so a native Montrealian, but now, you're here, you're in California, and I know that you have, as a psychologist, a big practice, and you're working and specializing with so many learning differences from ADHD to learning disabilities, to developmental differences. And when you see the challenges that individuals are facing, what are some ways that you integrate animals into the self-regulation piece, like you did with Sasha?
Again, it's not as simple as that, but I'll walk you through it a little bit.
Sure.
So over the course of those years, and again, I was involved in the field called animal-assisted interventions before it really was a known field. Again, Boris Levinson, who's from New York, was really one of the pioneers of that area, and he began this work in the 60s. So I got involved in this way early in this process, and fortunately for me, a lot of this was serendipitous. And what I mean by serendipitous, just like Sasha, I really didn't know what I was doing, right? But I did know something that we're going to talk about at some point today, which is the importance of the well-being of the animal. So whenever I work alongside a therapy animal, although I care about my human clients, I really try to preserve the integrity, the safety, the wellness of the animal so that everybody in that situation is safe. Mm-hmm. Your question is a good one. How did this begin? Well, you have to look at the research arena, if I can, that in the early 80s, actually it was in the late 70s, but the publication started really coming up in the 80s, where, again, research suggested that animals could be helpful in a variety of ways. First, they looked at people that had heart issues and found that people that had heart attacks that were recovering, those that had pets in their lives, did better a year later than those that didn't. And for sure, what we found out from that research is that one, and I'm sure your listeners have heard this, is that when you pet a dog, especially an animal you're comfortable with, again, your blood pressure will go down and your heart rate, your variable heart rate can become more in control. And so that early work began us for the scientific community to begin studying, yes, animals are good for our well-being, that not only will it change heart rate, then there were studies that began to come out looking at the hormone cortisol, and that's a stress hormone that basically when you're around an animal that you're comfortable with, your stress level can go down. And then furthermore, what we've looked at in the last 2.5 decades is the changes in neurotransmitters like oxytocin, that love hormone, the one that gives you the neurotransmitter that does the sparklies, where you feel that real connection. When we love something so much, we have that wonderful feeling take over us. Well, science is basically helping us better understand what I think many people have known intuitively for centuries, that animals are good for our well-being. And one analogy that I like to use is that in many ways, having an animal in our life is almost like having a biological spa treatment, that these benefits can accrue. Now, the question that you asked me is a good one, because it isn't that osmosis simple, that if we're doing it in therapy, and then we could talk about pets in general, if you'd like, when you're using or applying animal-assisted interventions therapeutically, you have to know what you're doing. And so although I said some of this was serendipitous, over the 50 years, I knew my background in psychology as a psychologist and understanding human behavior. I knew that well. What I didn't know really well were all these animal things, right? So over the 50 years, I've supplemented my background. And so I've learned about dog behavior, bird behavior, small animal behaviors, and ethology, so that I became much more cognizant of their way of living their lives. And so one way of really just understanding it with, of course, with persons with neurodivergency is that the animals, one, can act as a social lubricant, that sometimes it's easier to engage when you have an animal that is very conducive to want to interact. Dogs especially, so if I can digress a second, dogs especially have been domesticated. Some people say 15,000 years, some people go back 30 to 40,000 years. When the wolves started to become, or some type of wolf was starting to become more domesticated, it really meant that we allowed that animal closer into our circle because they gave us protection, but they were reading our behavior. And so over the last course of thousands of years, dogs have been domesticated, one, to read our social behavior to the point that they're very good at nonverbal recognition. And so they have a good feel of emotional contagion. They get those kinds of relationships with humans. And dogs are much smarter now, we understand, than we did, hundreds of years ago when people said that dogs had a certain intelligence level, because today we have a whole thing called canine science where we're trying to understand dog cognition. So dogs are very, very capable of reading situations. And in my work, for example, with many, many children, and I primarily only work with children, how many times have children come to visit with me and a gentle dog can bring a presence that helps with self-regulation and breathing and helps that atmosphere. How many children that I've worked with that at first may have been anxious about seeing me, but sitting next to a calm, well-trained therapy dog, for example, and beginning to pet, because we already talked that petting can change your heart rate, they become calmer and in the moment. When you talk about you being a speech and language therapist, how many children that I've worked with that had different levels of autism and ADHD would communicate much easier through the presence of the animal. They would do things that maybe they weren't as comfortable doing. So I think of so many children that I worked with that the first thing they do when they come to visit is they come and they sit next to the animal. Sometimes we practice breathing to get them ready to do the work that they came to work on. But the animals become their friends. And my dogs, because they read in many ways the behavior of the youngsters, they are very comfortable in doing that kind of interaction. And it's interesting in my work, it's almost like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Those of you that don't know who Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers were, they were great dancers. I'm not saying I'm a great dancer. Over the years, over the years, my work with animals, I've learned to dance like Fred Astaire and my animals, Ginger Rogers. Most of my therapy animals have been females, where it's seamless. Our work together is seamless, that they react in ways that maybe I didn't think about, that we work as a tandem.
That is so cool. So just even with your dancing skills, now we may be able to see you on Broadway one day, right? And doing a show, because it's that social lubricant that I feel like helps people connect even with their passions. Because a lot of times, right, our autistic teens and tweens and children who you work with have difficulty with channeling their passions because they're doing it all alone and they're having trouble engaging or initiating conversation.
And I think when you look at this, there's been enough research. You think of Temple Grandin's work.
Yes.
And Temple has talked a lot about the importance of animal relationships with persons with ASD. The reality is that the connection that we have with animals is unconditional. I think of some of the children that I work with, and I say this so deep-hearted, that for some of the children that I work with, they don't have friends. They don't have people that engage with them. So it's almost like when they come to visit me, it's like Cheers. Everybody knows your name. The animal is happy to see you, especially if you demonstrate kindness, warmth, and they're not as judgmental. And I think this is really important for us to understand. Again, maybe later on, we could talk about pets in people's lives and perhaps some things that we need to consider, because I think of one young person that I work with that had significant aspects of autism and could erupt very, very quickly, but she liked my therapy animals. She liked the dogs, although I had birds at that time and small creatures. She especially connected with one dog. And with the help of that dog, we were able to help navigate through her emotions, to help her learn to regulate, to learn how to express herself in a manner that got the dog to follow her. In fact, she became, in some ways, one of the things that we worked on was she became the teacher. Although in that case, Magic knew a lot of these commands, but she would show Magic, I want you to walk with me and sit. I want you to come. They crawled together as an activity. So again, the importance at first that you have to understand is relationship. And I think animals are less critical of individuals and are much easier to handle unique differences to make things go much more effectively.
Well, you beat me to it because you went straight to friendship, which is something that comes up over and over again. And there's so many parents that I've worked with over the years, and I'm sure you have too, that have said to me, if they can only have one friend, right? And of course, friendship looks different for different people. And even just taking that first step of initiating with someone is already a connection or social connection, right? And then obviously it elevates and, you can graduate to actually forming that bond with someone, which may not look like going out once a week. It could look different. However, the thing that you mentioned about how the individuals that come to you can sit with these animals and they're now showing signs of initiating and engaging, developing a friend, right? So that maybe that can even generalize outside of there because maybe the confidence is building. Maybe they start building confidence and they feel empowered that they can connect with a pet. And maybe then they can take that confidence outside with the teens and tweens being like the hardest years ever in general with friendships and people not being able to fit in.
The important aspect, I'm happy you talked about the word generalization, is you have to teach for that. So that's where my training comes into effect that I could give you so many other examples. And I'm going to give you one little story in a moment. But I can give you so many examples of youngsters that when they come see me demonstrate what I would call pro-social behavior. But it doesn't really matter that they do this pro-social behavior only with me. We have to figure out, can we make this happen in other environments like school, at home? And so I spent a lot of time giving kids behavioral homework. And sometimes it's not me that gives the behavioral homework, it's the dog. So for example, my dog writes letters to kids, and especially younger ones that have what I would call magical minds. They enjoy getting the letters from, in this case, Mystic, who's lying right there on the floor next to me right now.
I don't see Mystic. Mystic's
you don't
hiding
see her
out
because she's just lying on the side.
She's
but
tired.
In essence, we plan for generalization to occur. But I'm going to give one example since you talked about friendship. I remember a boy, and this boy is a youngster that today would have been diagnosed with ADHD. But I remember he was 6 years old, and he told his mom that he was invited to a birthday party, and he was really excited. And his mom said, he said to Mom, "Can I go?" And Mom said, "Sure, you can go. But, I'll tell you," and we'll name him Alan. Alan, when you go to these parties, or when you go places, what concerns me is that when it's time to leave, you, using your word, you melt down, and then it becomes so difficult. And he goes, "But mommy, I promise you I will be good. Let me go." And so she said that he could go to this party. And then every day, this was a Monday, every day he kept on saying, "Is it Saturday yet? It's Saturday yet." Finally, Saturday came. And when he went to the party, went to his mom, and his mom said, "Remember, when it's time to go and I get you, you have to leave." He says, I promise.
Right.
We went to the party, and when the party ended, the mom came to him and said, "It's time to leave," worrying that again, he could have that break in his behavior. And as he started to walk with her, he said, wait, I need to see her open up the presents at least. I think that's fair. And Mom said, "You're right. Let me let you stay and watch her open up the presents." So he did. Moments after that, Mom went to get him, and he started to walk away with her. And he said, "Wait." And then Mom said, "Oh, no, we're going to have a problem." And he said, "Mom, before we walk out the door, can I say goodbye to my friend?" And so what you need to understand, Sharon, he turned around and went to his friend, and we'll call his little friend PJ. That was her name. PJ wasn't a little 6-year-old girl, human. PJ was a 1-year-old golden retriever. And he went to a birthday party that was therapeutically designed. We had 60 children with neurodiversity all there, all well-behaved. And I still remember Alan embracing PJ and saying, "Thank you for inviting me. You're the first birthday party I've ever gone to." So friendships I can share with you over the course of 50 years, my animals have become initial friends to kids at various ages. We've taught children how to adopt their own pets in a safe manner. And for some of those individuals, that animal has been a conduit to visiting and meeting other people. Because one of the most interesting things, especially when I walked, or in the olden days when I had cockatoos and bearded dragons and dogs, could you
Wow, sounds
imagine
like a zoo.
when I would take a walk with many of them together? The animals act as social capital. People go, "My goodness, what's the name of your dog?" "Oh, I love cockatoo." And so for some of the children that I've dealt with, as they've learned to develop that responsibility with their own pets, they have become more engaged in their communities, in walking their dogs and doing things. Except there are some guidelines that we need to look at about companionship and some of the issues that come about. But there's enough research today that demonstrates the efficacy of animal-assisted interventions. And from that point of view, the value of human-animal interactions. I've given you a little bit of the science. Today, I think with social media and the popularity of this topic, I think in some cases it's a little bit misrepresented, but there's research that truly demonstrates the efficacy of our relationships with humans and animals. And in my case, from the person that never had an animal, how valuable that experience was for me. And over the years now, I brought up my own boys that have their own pets, and they have their own children, and they have pets in their own homes, because they've seen that gift, that wonderful gift of sharing your life with a non-human. And I think that's important for everyone to realize. But I also want to make sure everyone understands that this is not a silver bullet. It isn't the panacea, but it can be helpful. And I've given you a couple of examples already.
Well, first of all, I love your anecdotes. I mean, that story about the birthday party, like that really touched my heart. Like I have chills just thinking about that, because what that child was doing in that moment from that social thinking perspective is really just advocating for himself in such a powerful way and saying goodbye, which he had never done maybe before. It was even to even say goodbye when he's at a party. And you touch upon something so important, which was that this was also a neuro-affirming birthday party. It was set up in a way where there was a dog there, right? Where there were other individuals there. And I find that, like you said, it's not a panacea, but there are still supports that can be used that can bring children a long way, and eventually they can be really independent. But that independence doesn't happen overnight. So if we could utilize things like animals in a social thinking way, then why not? And you even mentioned how the dogs are writing the letters. The children are having different roles, which is like teaching them flexibility with others when they eventually start having friends, which they can be the leader, right? They're starting to teach the dog. So they go from the student to the leader of the dog, right? The teacher.
So being the giver rather than the taker.
Yeah. So they're like shifting roles or showing cognitive flexibility, all the pivotal things of social thinking that we try to do through observation. Speech pathologists that carry out social thinking a la Michelle Garcia Winner, that helps a lot of these autistic individuals. And it also just allows for them to have agency, because they're able to tell you, it sounds like, what they're interested in from the dog. Like if they want a letter from the dog, they can receive a letter. If they maybe want something else, a certain type of interaction, they can do that. And then it sounds like almost in some cases, they've become so connected that this is their peer model until they actually interact fully with a peer. Is that right?
A little bit. I think that there's an important piece to this when you mention agency. It's funny because the animals have agency in my work. We make sure that they're not toys, they're not little puppets, they're not there just to hang out. And so it's building relationships, building that level of comfort. And sometimes my animals will, because of the way I set this up, and I'm really conscious of their well-being, that I make sure that they're stressless, that they're not having difficulty in the situation. I think of sometimes kids come in perhaps very agitated when I was working in my own therapeutic office. Kids might come in very agitated with their parent, and I might say, well, would you like, for example, Magic or Ketsy, or in this case, Mystic, to come say hello? And if they say yes, they already understand the rules. So if you're going to have Mystic or Ketsy come say hello, what do you need to do? Now we're going to need to settle down a bit because my animals trust you. And I still remember one time, and that was Mystic coming down a hallway many, many years ago. This young man was about 12, really, really agitated at that moment. But when he said, do you want her to come? She came in nice and slowly down the hallway. And then as she went to greet him, she put her head in his lap and he began to stroke her. Then what was really interesting, and she's done this many, many times ever since, is that she went around the couch and then got on the couch and lied on him like a blanket of fur. And then I looked at him and said, are you now ready to talk about your feeling and having that control? So I think it's important that you realize that there's a lot of thought and preparation if we're looking at therapy animals. And if you're looking at persons with neurodiversity, we also need to recognize some of the challenges. Temple Grandin talks a lot about perception. And so some of the animals that I have to make sure, for example, some kids love the dogs, but I might have to bathe them in a non-odor-free shampoo so there's no odor that will make them concerned. Some of the kids don't appreciate the loud noises, barking. My animals don't bark in the office, or when I had cockatoos, which are large birds. Again, if the bird starts to chatter, that can change the dynamic. So again, understanding that in some ways, we have to understand the way a person thinks and acts and how that animal can perceive those reactions too, to make it more smooth.
Yeah, you make a really good point in that your program, which I think is a program that should be instituted across schools, across colleges, across everywhere. But unfortunately, I can't make that happen. But a lot of thought is put into this on both sides, because again, we have to protect the animals as well. And in doing so, that allows for that communication to be as elevated and strong as it is. Because like you said, if a dog is going to be stressed out, right, then the individual who's going to be coming to the dog is probably going to feel that stress as well, and vice versa, right? Everybody feels each other's emotions. I know with horses specifically, just because I love horseback riding. And I remember I was in New Mexico and it was on an Indian reservation, and they had taken these horses from traumatic experiences, and they utilized them in some cases for individuals with trauma themselves, so that both of them can feel connected in overcoming trauma. And so there was that connection, but a lot of thought put into it, because again, if one person's feeling off and the other person's feeling off, it could be kind of a collision of some sort, almost like when peers interact and they're just both having some sort of difficulty that's exacerbating their emotions to a high level, and the intensity is so high that the fire just kind of burns. So I understand how you have to also think about the animals, but these animals are ultimately, like in your story, I forget the kid's name, laying down and saying that he was now ready to actually speak a little and maybe advocate for what he needed. And this is where the unmasking shows up a little bit, showing up authentically as yourself, which is really the goal of the podcast, is helping children into transitioning to teens and tweens feel like they can be themselves, even though they may not be neurotypical, right? So I'm just curious, from your experiences with the animals and in the children, trying to work with them, gain confidence, do you feel like they start showing a little bit more of themselves as they interact more with these animals?
I think that we can look at pet companionship or animals in kids' homes, and how do you help families add an animal to their home? Because sometimes what you have to look at is the lifestyle of the family. That families having an animal, my golden retrievers, in my opinion, wonderful dogs. They have wonderful
You're
temperament.
not biased.
They have wonderful temperament, that perhaps they were born with. But, they can be busy little dogs early in their lives. So there's a lot of training to teach that behavior. So if an animal joins a family, how do we make sure that that relationship is established? How do we work with the youngster to enjoy wanting to be around that animal, to take that responsibility? Again, how do we make sure that everybody is safe, including the fact that in a home, I think children need to know that a dog or a cat has a safe place, that if they go to that safe place, that means they want to break and they want to be left alone. So the conversation that we have is almost like a two-legged stool, because in some ways we could be talking about therapists and clinicians working alongside what I would call therapy animals to provide an environment that is very supportive, enriching, as well as an environment that will teach. On the other hand, having animals in your life, especially young folks that are neurodiverse, can have tremendous benefits, especially when we talk about loneliness, isolation, social behavior, opportunities. But again, families need to know, are there better ways to do this? So it's interesting. I've written many, many books, and one book that I wrote is not really related to animals, although we have a chapter in that book on this, is the parent-child dance, which is on parenting. And the notion that we assume that parents know intuitively how to parent their children, but that's not totally the case, right? We could all benefit from learning perhaps better ways of how to do things with our kids. And so I think families that are going to consider having pets in their homes, what are some suggestions that they should consider as they adopt an animal into their home, so that youngsters aren't overwhelmed, that they become more involved in taking on some of the responsibilities, maybe not all of them. We also need to realize that there are times when the children may need time away, as well as the animal may need time away from that youngster. Wonderful book about a child growing up with a dog is My Dog Henry. That is a story about a young man and his dog in the United Kingdom. And that young man had autism, and they developed an outstanding relationship together. So again, what I'm hoping your listeners recognize is I really believe that there are many, many benefits for having animals in our lives. But we need to think this through a little bit, because along with the benefits are challenges. I've already mentioned the challenge of just coexisting. What's the challenge that some kids have? Because we all know that animals live shorter lives than we do. So learning how to say goodbye to an animal, and how does that relate to the situation? So there are areas that we can talk about. And I think my suggestion for families that are considering adopting animals, there's enough literature that gets you to think about things that maybe you haven't thought about that are important to consider, because you think of, for example, Dalmatians, and I'm only giving this example.
I love Dalmatians.
The example that I'm trying to give is that when the movie 101 Dalmatians comes out, people get really excited about adopting a Dalmatian, but they don't realize the challenges that come about when you have a young puppy that happens to be a Dalmatian. They all don't come in super calm and sweet. And I think that's what your people have to realize as they coexist with animals in their lives.
Yeah, coexistence. And I have a few follow-up questions to a number of things you just said that are just so eye-opening to anybody listening. One is, you mentioned that research has come such a long way, and partially thanks to you, because you've done a lot of research on this and the benefits of all of it. However, you said there's still some misunderstandings, like even on social media, the way people represent animals. Is there something specific that people are doing to represent animals in a specific way that isn't really so accurate?
I think that the real challenge is that we've sensationalized the bond. I'm a believer, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you hear stories of the dog that might have walked 100 miles to find their family, or we hear all of these aha stories. And to me, when I even think of my relationship with Sasha, and all the relationships I've had over the 50 years with different animals, it's not always the aha that's important, but it's the moments, the connections, the little things. So researchers need to help media kind of temper the over-exaggeration of the benefits of the human-animal bond. But there's even a term, the pet effect, is something that we talk a lot about, the benefits of animals in our lives. But I don't think when I get different pets in my life, I don't get the pets because of all the benefits I think I'm going to have. I get the pets because I want the companionship. I want that loving feeling. What's it like when you come home and if you had many dogs and birds, they're running to the door and they're sharing that exuberance, or sometimes they're just lying next to you in calmness. And that calmness is just a wonderful gift. So I think we need to be realistic. And the challenge again with media is that sometimes media does misrepresent some of the actual research. I don't think it's damaging, but I want it to be real.
Yeah.
That this again is not this silver, you get a dog and the next thing, everything's going to be great, because that's not true. But it can provide a tremendous avenue, a gateway to a richer life. And I think that that's important. When you mentioned horses, my university, Cal Poly University in Pomona, was Mr. Kellogg's of Battle Creek. It was his Arabian Horse Center. And in 1925, he gave that land to the state of California to build a university. That was 100 years ago.
Wow.
The reality is, over the course of the last decade and a half, it was a little late in my career at Cal Poly, I befriended one of the Arabians. And if I say to you that she's one of my best buddies, I've been there for the birth of several of her foals. The one little colt that was just born 4 months ago is named after me now.
You're a grandfather.
What I'm saying is actually her first horse, that was her first foal that was born 2 weeks before my human granddaughter was born. So I was giggled by saying I have two female grandchildren that were born 2 weeks apart. One has 4 legs, one has 2 legs.
That's so funny.
But what I'm trying to say is they have enriched my life. So sometimes what's important to realize is the benefits that can come from those relationships.
Right.
So powerful, but I don't want to misrepresent them completely. But you've heard some of the anecdotes and stories.
Yeah. And thank you for clarifying that, because there is a sensationalism. And I do see things on social media where people do even have Instagrams with their pets, or they create an Instagram reel or Instagram handle for their pet. And then people may look at that and think, oh, wow, I must get a pet immediately, but not necessarily prepare for what that means, especially when you have an autistic child who you're trying to get to interact with. So what I'm hearing is that if you're going to bring this into your home and you're not properly trained in terms of preparing not just the autistic individual, but the whole family, the family dynamic, then this can cause problems. And sensationalism is interesting because everybody wanted a Dalmatian. I mean, even now I look at Dalmatians and I think of 101 Dalmatians, right? But the reality is there's a lot involved. And one thing you mentioned was responsibility, having responsibilities, which, I mean, every parent that I've spoken to that has a pet has told me that the responsibilities were dodged by their kids. And at a certain point, right? Some keep going. And the thing is that we can capitalize on this moment instead of letting the child dodge the responsibilities, because especially for autistic children and teens and tweens, if they would be given those responsibilities, that would help them with the interaction, which can foster social development, really.
Again, knowing how to get your family involved in rearing an animal is something that's really important. So I think all I suggest for your listeners, and I wrote about this in a book called Our Faithful Companions, is how do we integrate animals safely in our home, and to recognize that we want to have animals in our home for their lifetime. And that means sort of planning for their involvement. And by doing so, you realize that it does change your lifestyle. And how do you deal with that? So it's just thinking through the issues. And especially if you have a child that may need a little bit more care in that interaction, making plans to have that work effectively is really important. But the blessing is that final outcome, which is the wonderful relationships that can be established with young people, teenagers, tweens, young children, as they grow and recognize the friend that they have. And I think that's really important. And it doesn't have to be a dog. It can be a cat. It can be a small creature like a gerbil, a guinea pig.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a bird. I had a young man that had autism that loved my birds, and he developed a relationship with a cockatiel. I have another youngster, now he's not a youngster, he's in his 40s, that developed a relationship with one of the conures that I had, and eventually he ended up getting that bird, and that bird has lived with him now for over 20 years.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
he talks about the importance of her in his life. So these are issues that we think about. I think that 50, 60 years ago, relationships with animals were less understood. Today, they've gone from the backyard and garages to our living rooms and our bedrooms.
And our schools.
We consider them our friends and our family members. And that has really opened up a whole new world with all kinds of individuals, including persons that have neurodivergency.
Yeah. And so this is a tough question, but there's also the other end of it where there are parents that are dealing with the chaos of just the everyday tasks of survival, having a few children, one who may be autistic, right? And don't feel like it's the right time to get a pet and may not ever feel like it's the right time to get a pet. However, I still, and especially even more so as you keep speaking, really believe that there is benefit in even just having a comfort dog at the school or at a clinic that you go to. Like, for example, your clinic is set up to have that. So my question is, we both mentioned generalization, but how, for those who can't have pets because it's just too hard right now for them, it's going to add a lot of stress and to everybody involved. How can they take what they learn from comfort dogs that are in different areas that they go to and then bring it home?
The generalization, for example, I teach kids mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
They may learn mindfulness next to my dog, but then when they go home and practice, they're not doing it with my dog. They're doing it with themselves, their family members, without the support of an animal. And for some children, just having the benefit of, like in school, you sometimes see reading dogs. There's been enough research that shows that one of the greatest benefits of a reading dog for a child with ASD is that the reading dog encourages an environment that's less stressful, and the child's anxiety goes down. That allows that child to read more comfortably. Well, you may not have the pet at home, but we might have at our library a dog, and that's doing reading with the kids once a week, and we might take advantage of that. We can visit with family members or friends that have animals. But I think your point is well taken, that for some families with the lifestyle that they have at that given moment, maybe it is not the best time to bring another member into their family. The part with school and how animals can be supportive, of course, as a teaching methodology, that the animals working alongside their human counterpart, like a teacher, speech and language therapist, or the psychologist, the therapy animal will make it easier for that child to perhaps learn. Because again, if we're looking at one of the true benefits of having an animal in a school setting, is that the animal traditionally can help support or foster less stressful situations because we can be more relaxed. If you're more relaxed, you're more willing to learn. The animal can act as not only a social lubricant, but as a motivator to do things. Like, how many times do I hear occupational therapists asking a child to maybe do an exercise of cutting,
Mm-hmm.
and the child won't want to cut the paper or the object, but all of a sudden when you say Fido is here. Can you help me cut the biscuit? Or can you take this cup, or which would be like a bowl, and fill it with water? All of a sudden you see them doing that because that's important. If we're teaching self-help skills in taking care of yourself or grooming, again, brushing the dog, let's brush your hair. How do you do it gently with the animal? How do you do it gently with you? So that's a whole other conversation that would take a long time to get into. But I think the platform that we've established today really can be tied together with the recognition that for so long, people really didn't understand the true benefits of the human-animal connection.
Mm-hmm.
Today, with the advent of our scientific unearthing, we're seeing more people better understand what we know intuitively. Surrounding ourselves with animals can be good for our well-being and good for our mental health. So I'm hopeful that that's the message that goes to your listeners as we sign off today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely taking that message with me. And you mentioned mental health, and it all goes back to that anxiety and the anxiety around communication. And that also ties into confidence. And you actually published many books, but one of them was Afternoons with Puppy a while back. And in there, you describe that healing process of people who are struggling with trauma. And I have so many teens and tweens that are dealing with trauma because in their earlier years, there was a certain level of neglect, whether it was in the schools or not, people just consistently misunderstanding their needs. And as a result, trauma builds up and they have to become more resilient. So is there a takeaway from that book that can help anybody listening, whether it's a family member, a professional, or a neurodivergent individual themselves, with that healing process and how the animal can help them with that?
You know, that's funny that you brought up that book. Actually, After the Puppy is sort of the metaphor that I used. I had a dog named Puppy. She was a rescued golden retriever. And you have to understand that as a college professor, I taught many classes in the morning and classes in the early evening. But the afternoons were special for me for so many decades, because it was the afternoons I worked with children, but they were at the afternoons that I worked with children alongside my various therapy animals. I named the book Afternoons with Puppy as a consequence of that title. The last chapter of that book is lovely. And the reason I say that, it's less, Afternoons with Puppy is almost like a memoir, but with tremendous case studies and things that we can learn from. But the last chapter of that book are the lessons that we can learn from the animals that we surround ourselves with. And so things like patience, not giving up. How many times have I seen dogs fiddle with things until they got it done? How there's a section on loyalty, on the importance of caring for a mate. And so, again, those are takeaways. When I think of Afternoons with Puppy, I always think of life is a voyage, and you have to be able to take that chance to enjoy what you have. And that last chapter of that book really talks about so many of these examples that animals have taught me while observing them do the things that they've done. And I'm happy you brought that up as a good way to end our conversation, because have I learned so much from my animals? I've learned that life isn't always so easy, but yet you can make things work out. I think of one of the dogs that I had. She had uveitis, which is like glaucoma. So she actually had to have her eye removed. And yet the kids loved her for the years that she walked around with, that she had one eye. And having one eye did make a difference to her. She saw, she did everything that she needed to do to have a good quality, enriching life. And so as we talk about tweens and teens with neurodivergency, I think what my animals have shown the clients that they deal with is that I like you, and I like you for who you are. And I like you for who you are because you're showing me a sense of care and kindness. And maybe if you have like a communication challenge, I don't judge that, because I'm with you, because I'm with you for the things that you do with me. And I think that those are lessons that we can all learn from the animals that we surround ourselves with, that we think that we're the teachers, but in some ways we can learn so much about life through the eyes of being around animals.
Literally through the eyes of being around them. And Dr. Fine, thank you so much for being here. There's so many stories that you shared that are going to touch and reach so many listeners, whether or not they get a pet or not. I hope that people who are listening also have some connections with schools around the country that can bring in these comfort dogs and maybe even bring them into their clinics just because of the power that they have and that they could give to our autistic teens and tweens, especially just through observation. And you mentioned the little doggy that you had that had glaucoma. And it's interesting because she walked around and said, I mean, didn't say this, but communicated, I don't have an eye and I'm still going to go forward. I'm going to push forward and despite everything. And what's also interesting is that the other individuals weren't necessarily looking at her, the people, as being different. So what I get from this conversation in a nutshell, and I hope everybody listening can receive, is the acceptance, the tolerance, the understanding of fitting in, that you can fit in with each other. And pets can teach us that, no, you don't have to judge somebody because of something that's different or that looks different. You can actually also push forward and be resilient, even if you have a serious condition that's trying to hold you back. And it's really all through the power of just observing these animals and learning from them. Dr. Fine, there are so many anecdotes, so many amazing lessons in here that so many people can learn from. Thank you so much for being here. I have one last question. Where can people find you if they want to reach you?
If they'd like, they can contact you.
Okay.
Or they can go online and I have a website, www.aubreyfine.com.
Okay.
And I'm happy to answer questions. And I have books that I've written on the subject.
Many books.
To be honest with you, Sharon, I wasn't here to promote my work.
No.
I was really here to talk about something that a little gerbil taught me 53 years ago, that an animal can be a great gift. And I'm so happy that I overcame that discomfort level and have lived just a life of joy alongside humans and alongside the animals. So if they're interested, they can go online to find me. They can contact you and get my email. And,
of course.
And I'm happy to write back to anyone that sends me a note.
Yeah, and your authenticity throughout this whole conversation was felt.
I appreciate you.